Already, Cam, thank you. Let's go to Annelise Nielsen now, Washington correspondent. We know that these executive orders have been signed, Annelise, including these new tariffs on aluminium and steel. This happened in the Oval Office, but it didn't happen with cameras live in the room. So this will be turned around. Sometimes that happens, so we hope to bring our viewers pretty soon with that. But it's really interesting to me, after hearing from the PM, Anthony Albanese, he would have spoken to Trump just an hour maybe before he then signed these executive orders. Then he's gone on to say there'll be no exemptions. And Anthony Albanese, in his press conference, has said, we agreed on wording to say publicly exemptions are under consideration. I mean, he's got to have a bit of confidence about it, but you've got to be a little bit worried, don't you?
Well, look, remember Kevin Rudd was on that phone call with Anthony Albanese. He's been a long-time mentor to Anthony Albanese in politics, and he understands the Australian political landscape as much as he understands the diplomatic landscape here in Washington, D.C. So I have no doubt he would have said to Mr. Albanese, you better get out there and say something now before these executive orders are signed. You got about half an hour, which is why there was the scramble in Canberra to try and put a positive spin on this, because look, there's really not a lot to be positive here at the moment, except for the fact they didn't tell us to go jump. And we're long-term allies of the United States. We have a long military history with them. We've fought alongside them in every major battle since World War I. We are really strategic allies, and we've been contributing to the industrial base here. And as our officials in Washington, D.C. have been working overtime to make the point, we do have a trade surplus. The US has a trade surplus with Australia. They spend more with us than we do with them. So there's no point levelling tariffs except for to make a broader point, which is exactly what Donald Trump is doing here now. He's saying, I am setting what the world expectation is. And frankly, Australia is just not that big in the scheme of things. We're not on the top 5 people sending aluminum or steel to the United States. We're not big players in this space. And so what we are doing through our lobbying efforts here is trying to say, hey, look, we are really batting above our average. We're on your side, and we're pretty important in the Indo-Pacific, so maybe cut us a break. But I think it's completely expected that Donald Trump would say that there's no exemption now. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be one in the future. And I made the point earlier this morning that these executive orders aren't always big fanfares in the Oval Office where he takes questions. This is kind of a new approach. But he does issue amendments quietly. He doesn't necessarily have to share them, and he does at his own benefit. And so one of the examples I was using was about this China tariff, where they leveled this 10% tariff on the Chinese. And in particular, what that closed was what's called de minimis rule. And that's, critics call it a loophole. They say that anything up to $800 people aren't paying tax on when it's coming into the country, and that's a loophole that should close. Those with a more free trade mindset say, hey, that's just such a nominal amount. Why aren't we just encouraging cross-border trade and letting people get small amounts from, maybe they're buying something from overseas that's very specific, and what's the point of wasting money enforcing such small amounts? What that has done is seen the proliferation of companies like Shein and Temu sending very cheap Chinese products, often undercutting American manufacturing and American material manufacturing, things like cotton, wool. They get undercut by these Chinese manufacturers sending cheap stuff over for the fast fashion industry, which everyone hates here because it encourages slave labor, it's bad for the environment, it's undercutting American manufacturers. So Trump closed that, and then the post office said, wait, how do we enforce this? There's so many different ways that we need to do this. How do you suggest we do this? And then just shut it off overnight. So then there was a quiet amendment to that executive order to turn it back on, to say, oh, okay, we can let you guys keep buying this stuff from China until we sort this out in the future. There's no reason that something like this couldn't happen for Australia quietly, but we are going to have to make a lot of noise. I can tell you from the US side, from being here in DC, seeing the Australians working, they're making as much noise as they can, but it's going to come down to making the case that we're putting that investment in the US, that we're building industry here, and they'll be using BlueScope as an example to say, hey, they're not really worried about these tariffs. Look at it, the share price has gone up because they invested in America. They want that to be the blueprint for Australia so they can show the rest of the world that's how you do it.
Yep. Spot on, Annelise. So good to talk to you. Thanks so much for talking us through it. We'll check in soon.